There's death, there's destruction.
Global news impacts us.
We have to change the way we live. This is why we need independent media.
Hello, cheers and salutations. Welcome to another episode of Hard Lens Media. As all of you have been following our programming, we've been interviewing many of the activists, organizers, journalists, speakers, musicians that will be speaking at the Rage Against the War Machine in Washington, D.C. on February 19th. Now, this is a movement that is made up of so many organizations, the Libertarian Party, the People's Party, Action for Assange, and so many others that have been speaking out against the neoliberal narrative. And today we have another guest who will be speaking at this event. His name is David Swanson. He is an author, activist, journalist, radio host. Again, he is also the director of World Beyond War. And as stated here, what it is, it's a global nonviolent movement to end war and establish a just and sustainable peace. Boy, oh boy, I wish we all had that in our time. I wish I saw that in my lifetime. He is also a campaign coordinator for rootsaction.org. Some of the books that he has written, again, is Leaving World War II Behind, War is a Lie, War is Never Just, When the World Outlawed War, and so many others. And again, he is going to be speaking at this event. David is also a Nobel Peace Prize nominee and was awarded the 2018 Peace Prize by the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation. If there's anything I've missed, please, everyone, David Swanson will correct me on it. First time here on Hard Lens Media. Welcome to our show, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Well, so I think there's a lot to really address in regards towards Rage Against the War Machine that's going to be taking place on February 19th. Obviously, there's a lot of groups and organizations that are a part of it, but yet, and this is something I brought up to all my guests, and I would like your perspective on this too. Each group, be it a third party, an independent organization, organization calling for the freedom of Julian Assange, or at least standing up against the military-industrial complex, each group has been smeared by the two-party system or corporate media. Why is it important for Americans to pay attention to this, and why are you standing in solidarity with these groups? I mean, we've always been told by corporate media, or been bombarded the propaganda from corporate media that, oh, third parties can't accomplish anything. These anti-war movements, they help out the Republicans, or they help out the Democratic Party. Why are you speaking there, and why should Americans be paying attention to this? Why are you standing in solidarity with these groups that will be there on February 19th?
Well, I've spoken at anti-war and pro-peace events for decades. My position hasn't changed with the party on the derriere of the throne in the White House. The people surrounding me on the stage change. There are many people who opposed wars when they were depicted as Republican wars, who just adore wars when they are labeled Democratic or bipartisan wars. And there are people now who oppose this war who I've never known to oppose any war before, and maybe never will again, though I hope that's not the case. But we need to oppose wars more fervently when we have two parties pushing them than when we only have one. I mean, this is basic logic. When you have both parties in Washington, D.C. lined up behind a war, we need more. We need increased public pressure to end it, not less. And we're not going to end wars if we keep looking for the good war. And let's not have this war. Let's be better prepared for a different war that's better. Let's have a war with a Republican in the White House. Let's have a war with a Democrat in the White House. We're never gonna defund the military that way. We have to oppose all wars, and the very idea that there can be a right side to any war. We need to oppose both sides of this war, and every other war, because the money that's dumped into it could transform the world, just a fraction of it. Until it goes nuclear, far more people are killed by the resources being dumped into the wars, the majority of your tax dollars being dumped into a war machine, than by the violence of the wars, which destroy the environment, destroy self-governance, justify secrecy, fuel hatred and bigotry and racism, blockade international cooperation when it's needed on global crises. I mean, it's the worst thing in the world, and it's an operation of mass murder, governments behaving in, more barbarically than we permit preschoolers to behave. It's the stupidest thing humanity does. So yeah, we got to be out there raising our voices, especially when the corporate media is unified in favor of a war.
I'm glad you brought up the phrase "good war" because, since 9/11, the Bush-Cheney administration led us to Afghanistan and Iraq, especially with Iraq, under the false pretense that there were WMDs, even though corporate media kept on singing it as, oh, there's a fact that there are WMDs in Iraq, even though we've never found them. And since then, under Obama, we went from 2 wars to 7. Under Trump's administration, he didn't become presidential until he started launching those big, beautiful rockets in Syria. And now under Biden, we've been wasting billions upon billions. And I'm going to say that again, more billions into this ridiculous war in Ukraine that at any second could potentially become hot, and then nukes are flying all around the world and mushroom clouds are in the sky, which is, again, absolutely devastating. So I want to ask you your thoughts on this. The good war. Why is it that both parties are on this mindset of, well, if we're in charge of the White House or in the Senate House, if the way we conduct wars will get to America better, or we can do it better than our other party, even though the military-industrial complex and all the corporations associated with it donate to both parties? Why is there this mentality, especially that's being spewed by corporate media to the American people? Oh, we need to have a good war, and with this party in charge, things will be better, and the other party can't do anything.
You know, somebody sent me a video today of Nancy Pelosi's daughter going on and on some talk show about how she adores George W. Bush. He's their family friend and father figure. And although Nancy voted against his war, that just doesn't matter. They're great. But yes, but here's the thing. Nancy worked diligently to fund and escalate and continue that war and prevent investigations and prevent impeachments and make sure that tortures and renditions and warrantless wiretapping and on were accepted. That there was no light between her position and George W. Bush's, other than one of these meaningless no votes on something you've made sure is going to pass before you vote no. That's it. And so the notion that, you know, there's really real opposition now from Republicans or then from Democrats is way overblown. Both parties are largely in lockstep with very few exceptions. People like Dennis Kucinich, who used to be in Congress and will be at Rage Against the Machine, one of those exceptions that we don't have anymore on the Democratic side, not a single member who's willing to step out against war. Why? Because people in the United States grow up saturated with millions of hours of every form of infotainment telling them of the glories of certain wars, overwhelmingly World War II, but a handful of others, and the idea that there can be a good war and a legal war and a justifiable war. There can't. And we can discuss all the reasons why there can't be, but this is accepted in U.S. culture. And so you can get crowds in the street against a war when it's the other party's war. But as soon as you're told that it's a good war and you're identifying with a party rather than with your policy choices, then you stay home, right? And when Obama comes in and says, well, Iraq sure is a bad war, but Afghanistan's a good war. I mean, how did World War II become a good war? Because Vietnam was surely a bad war, so they needed a good war. It didn't become a good war until Vietnam. And it's this insistence on any opposition to war stipulating that there's also a good war. You can't just be against a war. You have to point out that there is a better war that you'd be for. Otherwise, what are you, some crazy pacifist, right? And this is what U.S. culture does to this debate.
And I want to actually just go a little bit further into the idea of a good war, because as growing up as a kid, I think even my viewing audience, and you yourself have seen it too, we've been bombarded with the images of the Second World War. Let's be very clear here. Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, the Empire of Japan, I mean, these were aggressing nations that were going to war. And of course, the United States got involved. But what people don't acknowledge or fail to remember is that you had Ford and General Motors giving resources to the German Third Reich. No one talks about how Coca-Cola used to deliver some of their refreshing drinks to the forces, especially in North Africa. I don't know if you're familiar with the story where they would put the Coca-Cola bottles in wet paper towels and fly them up in the air, and then they'd be nice and cold. So, and then of course, Walt Disney's love for Mr. Hitler himself. But the thing is, what I want to get to is how World War II is perceived as this is what a good war looks like, and now the U.S. is saying we have to always keep in this mentality because we have to stop these villains, whoever they may be, across the ocean or in some other part of the world. We're bombarded with these images. Why is that? I mean, is this the way to keep people in line? Is it the way to keep people say like, oh, well, this is what a real victory looks like? Because it seems to me we've been at war since 2001, a forever war. And even though they supposedly say we're no longer in Afghanistan and Iraq, our forces are still present in Afghanistan and Iraq and in many other conflict zones across the world. I want to give the floor to you.
In fact, there hasn't been a moment in the history of the United States when it wasn't at war. David Vine's latest book covers that very well. This recent story in the media where it's absolutely shameful and dangerous not to give Germany, to have Germany with tanks rolling east, even though the German tank is essentially the image of evil in U.S. entertainment. I mean, an incredible feat of propaganda to flip that. But as you say, people don't remember that when the U.S. troops arrived in Germany in World War II, they were surprised to see the Germans driving U.S. vehicles, because without U.S. corporate support, according to various top Nazis, the war never could have happened. Right. And so you talk, I think it's easier for them to tell us lies about a war that's 75 years old than it is to tell. They try their hardest on wars as they're happening and just after they're over, right? But it's easier to go back that far, so that it's taken 75 years to have PBS do something like Ken Burns' latest, the first Ken Burns endless movie I'll recommend, the one on how the United States refused to save the Jews, right? When we're told that World War II was all about saving the Jews, and of course had nothing whatsoever to do with it and prevented it. Rachel Maddow's recent lengthy video series on fascists and German Nazis in the US Congress, I think the reason that these people are willing to produce things I actually like for the first time in history is because they're connecting long ago US fascist movements with Donald Trump. So they're not being anti-American, they're being anti-Trumpian. And so now it's acceptable to talk a little bit about how much support there was in the US government and US society for fascism in Italy and fascism in Germany and fascism in the United States, and how little World War II had to do with any sort of good intentions or spreading of democracy or defense of the United States or anybody else. And I hope that, that we can open up. This is why I wrote a book called Leaving World War II Behind, that I hope some people will read. I hope that we can open up the conversation about what World War II really was, because it was the single worst thing humanity has ever done to itself in any short period of time, and it was not justified on any side.
And again, I don't want to say too much on the subject, but I mean, just even the way the Axis powers, the leaders, have been portrayed, at least according to corporate media or how we're all witnessing them, they're portrayed as the Saturday morning cartoon villain, and we got to stop them, or else there goes freedom. And it just seems like now the United States is still doing that ongoing search for its next antagonist. And of course, Donald Trump, he's easy to be viewed as a villain, even though people forget he was a Democrat, a diehard Democrat for quite some time. But let's face it, even Hillary Clinton was a Goldwater girl. It's all one big club, and you ain't in it. It's to quote George Carlin. I mean, the man was on point and ahead of his time. He's probably rolling in his grave, or he's at laughing at us from above, after seeing how correct he was and on the mark, and just regards how our neoliberal system is consuming us. So what I want to ask you in regards to this is, and this might be a little bit of a touchy subject, but For me, witnessing the aftermath of the Bush-Cheney administration, we get into Obama's administration. The anti-war movement seemed to have died down. Everyone's going to brunch. Then comes in Trump, who is a reaction of Obama's neoliberalism. We must only look forward. Even though he led us from 2 wars to 7, he got rid of habeas corpus, never held the 2008, the people caused the 2008 recession accountable, never held the Bush-Cheney administration accountable. Here comes in Trump. Everyone's saying that he's Hitler 2.0. There's huge amounts of activists and anti-war movements, and then we get Biden, and everyone's right back at brunch. Where is the anti-war movement? Is it dead? Because when I was interviewing Supreme, he says it's still around. And I'm inclined to believe, but in many ways, if all this was happening under Trump right now, people would be out there in the streets. People would be screaming from the rooftops. People would be doing this or saying anything just to get clicks or views or clout because Trump is the face of a bad guy, an easy cartoon villain. Is there an anti-war movement or is it gone?
Well, I certainly talked that way when Obama was in there. I said, if only they would put some lousy right-wing Republican who's not smooth and slick in the White House, then people would get active and oppose all of this madness. And they really didn't. Not in any significant way, not even to compare with the Occupy movement or the Black Lives Matter movements that happened when Obama was there. We had more activism, in the latter years of Obama and with very, very limited constraints. But there hasn't been a peace movement of the size of 2002, 2003 since then. And that didn't compare with the late 1960s, and that didn't compare with the 1920s. I mean, we don't have what's needed. Now, there's always been this pair of problems, not having the peace movement we need and not telling anybody about what we do have, right? Because there are always people doing wonderful actions, getting local resolutions passed, stopping trains full of weapons, getting decent legislation through, educating thousands of people about peacemaking and the power of nonviolence and the evils of war, and there's no reporting on it. So people are always asking guys like me who work 24/7 every day of the year on peace, why isn't there any peace movement? Well, there's always some peace movement. It's not the size it needs to be. And nobody knows about the size that it is. But if you go to places like worldbeyondwar.org and look at all the reporting we try to do ourselves, because the New York Times won't do it, on the activism that's out there, there's lots of it, and it's inspiring, and people are getting money, getting public dollars taken out of the weapons industry. People are preventing new military base construction and all kinds of things all the time.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we see the at least how the media portrays war, and at least how corporate media is portraying, especially this horrifying conflict that's taking place in Ukraine, everyone must be lockstep right behind. And now we're at one point when the United States, each at one point when the war was initially starting, was saying, oh, well, we're only going to be there just during financial support. And then slowly became more weapons and more financial support, to where now it's here come the tanks. And now Zelensky's asking for fighter jets. With this conflict in Ukraine, is this an area where, again, the military industrial complex is just testing out its weapons? This is just a proxy war in which they can test out new weapons, new tactics, for future conflicts that, surprise, surprise, we all might see somewhere later on down the road. What is the overall conclusion with this? What is going to be the overall end game? Because at the end of the day, we see what these sanctions are doing. Millions of people, so that's not only Ukrainians, but it's the Russian people, it's the people of Europe, are dealing with this overall deadly conflict, and there seems to be no end game in sight. Diplomacy should be taking place here. And in fact, diplomacy should have taken place the minute the first round was fired. But now that ink is already dry. I think a lot of us do want to know, what is the overall plan? And obviously you've been covering so much in regards to the military industrial complex and what the United States does. The floor is yours. Tell us.
Well, it's not aid. We give us our money back. We want the money that's doing so much good for the Ukrainians. Well, it's not doing any good for the Ukrainians. Most of it's not going outside the Beltway. It's going to the 5 biggest weapons dealers on earth, which are within the U.S. Washington, D.C. Beltway, and they're sending over weapons to prolong a war that could have been ended, that should be ended, that the United States and the United Kingdom and NATO have been preventing ending for months, and blaming Ukraine. So we can't end it, it's up to Ukraine, while providing endless weapons and under the table, insisting that it not be ended. Do I know how it will end? Of course not. There's an ever greater risk that it will end with nuclear apocalypse. And that's why we need to be active, but we don't know for sure that it will, or we wouldn't bother trying to prevent it. But, you know, when Donald Trump says I'd end it in 24 hours, I think any idiot could, you know. I don't know whether that particular idiot would or not, but I think any idiot could. I mean, it's not as if we don't know what needs to be done. You need to say to Zelensky, who's out of control, like Frankenstein's monster, you know, scale it back. The weapons are ceasing to come. It's time to negotiate peace. You're not going to get as good a deal as you had before the war, but you're going to get a pretty darn good one. If we're going to, you know, do anything resembling this stuff we keep talking about called democracy, you're going to have to let the people of Crimea and Donbass decide their own fate with observers from all sides. You're going to have to get out of military alliances and start disarming and start practicing actual democracy. And we're going to have to say to Russia, time to sit down and compromise and get your weapons the heck out of the area. And the United States will do the same and start serious disarmament negotiations. Of course, it's very difficult when you've got NATO leaders running around saying they've been lying for years, and the Minsk II agreement was just a fake. It was no more serious than a treaty with Native Americans. It was just a ploy to stall for time. Why would anybody believe anything you negotiate now? But you've got to try, and it wouldn't be that hard. But you have to be willing to stop the weapons. That means stop the profits. That means stop the campaign funding from the weapons dealers. That means stop the praise of corporate TV for what you're doing. But so be it. Gives life on Earth a chance.
Yes, and of course, if the nukes were to drop, let's just face it here, folks, there is no great recovery or reconstruction. To quote a line from Dr. Strangelove, the survivors will envy the dead if there are any survivors. But that's not a laughing point, folks. Trust me on it. If you want to see a frightening movie, see the film Threads. It's not for the faint of heart. So what I want to ask you now is in regards towards the military-industrial complex and its influence over the two-party system. We've seen politicians, people that I think a lot, especially on the left, who have admired and respected, most notably the Squad, Senator Bernie Sanders, being silent, or he's being very pro-war. It's not only this conflict in Ukraine. There is the infamous scene where AOC was crying and changed her no vote to a present when Nancy Pelosi was yelling at her to do so. For the Iron Dome for Israel, we're seeing so many of our progressive leaders, air quote progressive leaders, just doing this. Is there any, there's been this talk of somehow reforming the Democratic Party or trying to change it so it could be more progressive, but yet all the progressives we seem to elect into the Democratic Party just march in step with the DNC, and in many ways the DNC is holding hands right next to the GOP. Is there any real chance to reform those two parties, or is it just a lost cause and we have to look at an alternative? Because at this point, I can't consciously vote for the Democrats. I sure as hell won't vote Republican. Can it be done? And was there ever a point where maybe both these parties might change? Because we see from authoritative sources on social media with the coveted blue check mark say, oh no, just vote harder and they'll listen to you.
There are all kinds of election reforms to push through. There are, you know, you can do your lesser evil voting or your actual good voting. But the important thing is to cease identifying with one of these two parties and cease believing their BS. When you have Larry Cohen this week write an article of the DNC, write an article saying when they had the last big military spending bill, they have a vote on a rule to put it on the floor, and that's a party vote. So the Progressive Caucus was able to influence the rest of the Democrats to keep the dirty oil deal of Joe Manchin out of it. Well, then they were able to use their power to get the other Democrats to scale back the record military spending if they had wanted to. And they didn't want to, but they want you to believe they want to. And they're about in the coming days to introduce a bill again, to cut the military spending by 10%. That is never going to pass the House. If it did, it wouldn't pass the Senate. If it did, it wouldn't be signed by the president. The way you exercise power is the way that they show they know perfectly well how to do when it comes to something like Manchin's dirty deal, but they don't want to on military spending. But they don't want you to know that. So I think that the first thing is to start identifying with policy positions that give life on this planet a chance. And set parties aside and stop identifying with a party and believing a party's BS. The line from the Democrats is that billionaires and corporations are all taxed to the hilt now, and we've made them pay their fair share now. I mean, if you actually believe that sort of stuff, then you don't go out and demand that they do it in the next session. And so I think it's a question of becoming independent and people telling the parties what to do instead of allowing the parties to tell you what to think. And then we'll have, a lot of reforms to force through, and we need a lot more people in the streets, not just on the phones and social media.
That's absolutely correct. And in many ways, the Pentagon, I mean, when have they ever had a successful audit? Has the Pentagon ever been audited?
No.
And have they ever followed through with it? I mean, again, short answer. I mean, the answer is no. I mean, obviously, it's an easy question, softball question. But, it's kind of difficult to really watch people still being successful. And I say this, it's a controversial thing I like to say, and I don't want to try and diminish anyone or put anyone down, but corporate media, the two-party system, have done a successful job in keeping many Americans complacent or trust in the system as is, because it's what we know. It has successfully trained generations to believe the word of the corporate media, believe the word of Team Red or Team Blue, the Republicans and Democrats. And you got to associate yourself with one or the other. You got to listen to the authoritative sources, the people's wearing the suits and ties and the fancy dresses who look like they know what they're talking about. But in all reality, they're just ahead of the curve, and they're people who make horrific, long-lasting mistakes. What do you want to say to people that are perhaps maybe now awakening and realizing that they're in a neoliberal nightmare that we're all drowning in, that are hesitant to get involved, that might look at something like Rage Against the War Machine? It's going to be taking place on February 19th. And they're interested, but maybe slightly skittish, maybe afraid to take that bold step across the Rubicon, say, I'm going to stand up against the two-party system. We got to stop these ridiculous regime change wars. If you're speaking to someone who's hesitant right now, but is becoming aware, what do you want to say to them so that they are at least watching or following what's going to be happening on February 19th?
I would say I see sports arenas packed. I see vacation resorts packed. There are people who have time and resources who could go to a peace rally and are choosing not to. And 40 years ago, we had some of the biggest rallies and activism in this country against the nuclear weapons. And they were a huge success. And the vast majority of the nuclear weapons were dismantled and done away with. But they kept enough to destroy the planet many times over. And your television and your newspaper said the Cold War has ended. And you believed it because they said it. It was absolutely meaningless when the weapons are still sitting there and they're still ready to use them at a moment's notice. And our luck is not going to hold out. So this is a question of the survival of life on the planet. If that doesn't rank fairly high in your priorities, something's askew. And if it does, and you think you should sit home and moan and groan about it, you're going to have a lot better time coming out and doing something about it. It's far more fulfilling than sitting home and whining. I know it's a pain and traveling is a hassle, but we got a big country. We have to travel farther than people do in smaller countries where the capital's nearby. It's our responsibility. We've got the country that's doing the most damage to all the other countries, and that all the other countries tell U.S. pollsters is the biggest threat to peace in the world. So it's a responsibility we have because of we were born here for better or worse, lots of advantages. This is a disadvantage. Deal with it. We got to show up. We got to speak out, and nobody else is doing it. So if you understand and you're with the program, you got to get out there and bring 10 friends.
All right. And I think that's a great note to end it on. I know that, we're appreciative of your time coming on to our show. Shout out to all the people from Rage Against the War Machine that got us in contact with you. Again, David Swanson, author, activist, journalist, writer, again, radio host and organizer, and so much more. Here's where you could just read about his bio here on Rage Against the War Machine. Obviously, he has done a lot. There's a lot more that I've missed on. I send my apologies. I should have had more of that on my notes here. But again, folks, we need to be paying attention to what's going to be happening on February 19th. For our viewers and subscribers, if they want to follow you on social media, where can they go?
David C.N. Swanson, C as in Christopher, N as in Naylor, David C.N. Swanson. That's my Twitter and Facebook and so forth. And I'm at davidswanson.org.
All right. That is a fantastic note to end it on. Again, David, I'm very grateful for the time that you've given us here at Hard Lens Media. All the best to you and all the speakers and attendees that will be being there and out at Washington, D.C. on February 19th. Now more than ever, we have to fight for a better future, and we all need to start speaking out against it because we're only on this planet once, and we all share this planet. Let's make sure that there's another generation that can enjoy peace. Dare I say, maybe eventually a peace in our time. What that looks like, I hope to see it, because right now, even I don't know the definition of it. Again, David Swanson, all the best to you, and we will be continuing on with the rest of our main program. Peace, everyone. See you in just a few short minutes. Take care again.
Thanks. Peace.